Well, hello. We are now in week two, and I wanted to go over some things still covering the 1920s, right after World War One, which is kind of where we had left off. So I'm going to go into that today. All right, so I'm going to go into the presidency and the economy of the 1920s. So if you guys can see that, let me move this up here. Here we go. All right, so the worst president in American history, Warren Harding. So he is basically going to be the president here. Um, he appointed his friends to high-ranking positions, as we talked about before last week, and we wanted to return to normalcy after World War One. This is considered to be the lost generation. Again, lots of men have lost limbs, don't know what to do as far as going back to work. Many have lost their husbands and fathers and sons. So basically, we're trying to look at getting back to normal. Isolationism, avoided foreign alliances. So we're trying to stay away from that, especially after what we just went through in World War One. Called for disarmament of European nations. So we want every nation to cut down on building tanks, rifles, things like that. War debts, European debts were scaled back to allow their economies to recover. So let's see if you guys can see that right there. Nativism. So if you guys remember, we talked about that when we were talking about immigration, flood of people coming in during the between 1870 and 1890. And nativism was those that were, you know, at some point in time, they came to America as well from probably Britain or France, but of course they had established families over the years, so they see themselves as natives. They hated immigrants. Okay, had such a hatred for immigrants, especially from those that are either from Southern Europe or Eastern Europe, and as well as any Jews. So patriotism, immigrants weren't loyal to the U.S., which they felt was a big problem with World War One. Religion, new immigrants were Jews and Catholics, unlike Protestants that mostly came before. Urban conditions, many flooding to the cities, as we talked about, as far as the second wave. Many of them were living in slums, stacked up in rooms of with people of about 20 or more sometimes. Competition for jobs, that becomes a big problem. And then Reds, some immigrants were part of radical political groups. The main one we're going to be talking about is the communist movement. All right, so the answer to that problem was quotas, limits on immigration. So under Harding's presidency, they began to severely limit immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe and denied immigration from Asia, which means China and Japan. If you guys remember, again, that's our conversation we had about a month ago. So the scandal. So we talked a little bit about the Teapot Dome in the last PowerPoint. So this was basically officials were stealing money. Remember, Harding put all his friends in high positions who weren't necessarily qualified. Officials taking bribes. Harding's Interior Secretary Albert B. Fall was kind of like the main guy of this. They let an oil company drill on government land in exchange for $300,000 in gifts. So remember, this was the land that was mentioned in the task. I forgot what task it was, but it goes a little more detail in parts of California, and I believe Wyoming was the other territory. So Mr. Harding dies from a heart attack in 1923. Some say my wife Flossie poisoned me. I was the first president to visit Canada and Alaska. So who comes in next? Calvin Coolidge, aka Silent Cal. So Also, did you know that I had a pet raccoon and a pet donkey? So that's a little fun facts about Calvin Coolidge. He was Harding's vice president and won re-election in 1924. So he took his place after he died and then also won the next election. So he really believed in this idea of laissez-faire, meaning that keep the government out of business. So the chief business of the American people is business. Whole ideas of capitalism. Leave business alone and the nation will thrive. That was the idea. Lowered income taxes, increase and protect tariffs, did not help the depressed agriculture industry, which we talked about before. That's one of the reasons why those that are farmers will probably pretty much hit the Great Depression before everyone else. And then the foreign policy called the Kellogg-Briand Pact, definitely one to know, highlight, okay? And this is basically saying 60 nations outlawed war, but no enforcement rules. They're saying we're not going to go to war. We're going to sit down and talk based on the Kellogg-Briand Pact and try to take care of our differences that way. No more war. That was the whole idea. The economy of the 1920s. Well, bye, bye, bye. You got the Ford, the T Ford going out there, all types of new cars. The 1920s economy was booming. People spent more money than ever before. So it says the consumer economy depends on a large amount of spending by consumers. A lot of you guys know this. Like, for example, we kind of say our success in our economy, a lot of times it's based around what we do during Christmas time, how much money we spend. So prior to the 1920s, shopping centers did not exist. So your big malls, all that kind of stuff. No fast food, no McDonald's, no billboards. Americans valued thrift, only buy what you need, paid cash for everything. So this is how life was before the 1920s. Now, after the 1920s, of course, things are going to change. So we started this whole idea of clever advertising. As you guys notice, sexy ladies with a cigarette trying to sell their cigarettes. All type of billboards with people showing themselves as being cool, drinking something, wearing something to get you to go out and buy. Just like we do today, we use a lot of times NBA players, football players to advertise shoes. So that way people go out and buy shoes. Am I going to be like Jordan? Things like that. So new products, lower cost, higher wages, and of course, credit. So credit cards, you name it, basically being able to buy something and pay for it later. All right, so with the higher wages, businesses realized that workers could also be customers. So they paid them high wages. So if I'm going to pay you more, you're going to be buying our products, right? Also giving them credit for things. Okay. What about big items, things like refrigerators, automobiles? Okay. So how do we handle that? Don't want to be paying large, cash amounts for that. So they create these things like this idea of installment plans. A lot of you guys may not have heard of layaway because they don't do that much anymore, but it's very similar to what we've done 30 years ago, which is layaway. You pay on it and then you will finally get your item. So pay a little each month and get charged interest. This use of credit led to debt in many U.S. households and increased sales for companies. So in a way, it's like you're giving people credit who probably cannot afford it in the first place, especially if you're tacking on interest. It's kind of like those payday loans they have out today, where uh, they basically advertise a lot of times to older people to go out and, hey, you can take out a loan here. The interest rate on it is astronomical, and they find themselves not being able to pay that money, and they pay probably triple to quadruple the amount that they borrowed. Clever advertisements made this buy acceptable. With all the extra money, companies had to compete for customers. The answer was ads. So as you guys can see here, so the women's greatest hygienic problem, using many of the same techniques as war propaganda company marketed products aimed at insecurities and fear. Use radio, newspapers, and magazines, mass media. All those were ways to advertise. So, the growth of mass media. Mass media adds to the growth of a national culture. So, if you look here, between 1920 and 1929, daily newspaper circulation rose from approximately 28 million to 40 million. So, everyone's reading a newspaper. Between 1922 and 1929, the number of people attending movies rose from 40 million per week to 80 million. And back then, it wasn't necessarily the previews of other movies. They would actually run ads or commercials about things to buy. Between 1922 and 1929, the number of households with radios rose from 60,000 to 10 million, 250,000. I mean, almost everyone had a radio. Listen to the fights, listen to different games, the Olympics, whatever it may be, is being played on the radio. Henry Ford and the automobile. Increased demand by making the automobile affordable to most Americans. Assembly line increased the speed and lowered the cost. So if you guys remember when we did the Industrial Revolution, the whole idea of the assembly line, one person constantly putting on tires, one person constantly putting on the doors. This increased the speed of the material that, or the cars that could be made. Ford's Michigan plant turned out a Model T car every 24 seconds. So that's fast. 1914, a Model T was $490. By 1925, it dropped to $390, $100 less. So that's a big deal back then. Ford bought coal, iron, glass, and wood. I'm trying to get the rest of that there. All right, sorry, I'll have to go back to that part later. So you can see here, the car is coming through, coming off the shelves. Welfare capitalism. Companies started looking after their workers to decrease the power of unions. Raised wages, supplied health care, limited education, paid vacations, raised company loyalty and morale of workers, and organized labor lost. All right, so take a look at personal debt. So all these new products and credit put most Americans deep in debt, just like today. Workers believed that their wages would continue to rise and then they could pay off debt. In 1920, the US had 49 billion in personal debts. In 1929, it was 72 billion. So that's a lot. So, as we can see here, as we begin to speculate, the stock market of 1920 was skyrocketed. Okay. Think about what's going on today, how the stock market is going down when things like this happen. So let's continue to look and compare. So kind of keep that in the back of your mind. Many people would buy high risk stocks with the hopes of making it big. This was called speculation. Just like now, some people might be moving their money out of certain areas into, let's say, toilet tissue, thinking that that's going to skyrocket and be able to make some money off of that. Buying on margin.